Nazir, I don't have access to a car, so why not be
Okay then.
big talker? You've never offered. You only offered after I was here already once.
Right. When you take someone else, your neighbor, he doesn't even take you.
On Daf Lamed Heyam and Beis, 3.5 lines before the end of the Daf, Lamed Heyam and Beis. This was yesterday's Daf. Omer Rabbi Avo, Omer Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Isurim Shabbatorah, Ein Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, Chutz me Isurei Nazir, Sharei Omer Torah, Mishras. According to Rabbi Yochanan, we put Isurei Nazir on one side and all other Machalos Asurus on the other, whereas the general rule is Ein Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, but the exception to that rule is going to be Nazir. And the Torah went out of its way in Mishras HaNovim to tell us that if you take a pas, you take a loaf or a piece of bread, and you soak it in yayin, and then the Nazir eats it, he'll get malchus, even though the yayin is less than a kizayis. So Heter Mitztaref LeIssur means that you could be mashlim the shir kizayis with Heter. So you only ate half a zayis of Isur, and you don't get malchus for half a zayis of Isur. But since you added another half a zayis of Heter, then Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, and you can get malchus for that combination, integrating Heter and Isur. That's in the case of Nazir. And that's derived from a special pasuk of Mishras HaNovim. However, in the cases of all other Isurim, let's say, for example, I have a chatzi zayis of chelev, and I eat it together with the chatzi zayis of basar heter, I would not get malchus because there's no halacha of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur in Shari Suri Torah, only in Nazir. And at the beginning of today's daf, which is Daf Lamed Vav, we have the sheet of Zeiri that Heter Mitztaref LeIssur applies not only in the case of Nazir, but also in the case of Si'ar with Haktar. What does that mean? The Torah says, Kol Si'ar, Ki Kol Si'ar v'chol dvash lo saktiru mimenu ishe Hashem. And that's a pasuk at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra. So the Torah prohibits Haktara of Si'ar. You're only allowed to be maktir matzah, not Si'ar. He took a half a zayis of Si'ar and a half a zayis of matzah, and he was maktir them. And the Torah says, according to Zeiri, that he will get malchus. Why? Because Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. We can be mashlim the shir kizayis by integrating the Heter into the Isur. And that's derived from the extra word kol. As the Gemara says, Keman ki Rebbe Elazar did darish kol. Now this Rebbe Elazar brings us to a different sugya in Shas, and that's in Pesachim, a little bit earlier than I think you gentlemen started. I don't know, it's on Mem Gimel and Beis. Did you start already on Mem Gimel and Beis?
We started
Ayin, right. Ayin Vav. Yeah. So anyway, a little bit earlier, you missed it by a couple of weeks or months. On Daf Mem Gimel and Beis, the Gemara there quotes a brisa which records a machlokas between Rabbi Elazar and the Chachamim as to whether or not we darshan the word kol. And what's the subject of that sugya? That's called chametz b'taroves. So you have a mixture called kutach habavli, which is kind of like a yogurt that has stale bread mixed into the yogurt, and it's used as a dip. And according to Rabbi Elazar, if you eat kutach habavli, you get malchus. Why? Because when the Torah says that you're not allowed to eat a tarovis chametz, it says kol machmetzes lo sochelu. And the extra word kol in that pasuk, according to Rabbi Elazar, kol machmetzes lo sochelu, is going to teach us that Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. So even the yogurt part is mitztaref to the kizayis in order to generate malchus, even though the chametz that he ate that's mixed into the kutach habavli is less than a kizayis. And that's derived from the word kol. Now, if Zeiri is applying the halacha of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur to Haktora si'ar, based on the word kol, because it says ki kol si'ar lo saktiru, then likewise, in the case of chametz, applying the principle of Rabbi Lazar, that if the Torah adds the word kol, like in the pasuk kol machmetzes lo sochelu, then it's coming to include Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, and therefore Yechayev Malkus for Kutach HaBavli. So why did Zeiri say that, you know what, in Kol Atar Kula, the only two Isurim that lend themselves to Heter Mitztaref LeIssur are one, Nazir, because of Mishras, and number two, Aktora Si'ar, where he adds a half a zayis of matzah because of the word kol, because it says kol Si'ar lo saktiru. So the Gemara now objects. Now we have a third case, which Zeiri should admit lends itself to the principle of what? Of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, and that's going to be Taroves Chametz, because if you're darshaning the word kol, then you should be consistent, and we're going to derive from the word kol in the parsha of Chametz that kol machmetzes includes even Kutach HaBavli, which is Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. So that's the Gemara's kasha here. And basically the Gemara says, Ein Chinami, but for technical reason, Zeiri wanted to say a special chiddush in the case of Haktorah, because he was really rejecting Abaye and accepting Rava in an issue about what the minimum Haktorah is for which you can be chayiv. Okay, so that's a little bit off on the side, but let's just summarize what we have. So on Daf Lamed Hey Amud Beis, the previous Amud, we have Rabbi Yochanan, who says that there's no Heter Mitztaref LeIssur in any Issur with the exception of what? Of Nazir, because in Nazir the Torah says Mishras. Now we have Zeiri, and Zeiri says, forget about the drosh of Mishras, that's going to be one case of Nazir, but now we have a drosh of Kol. And based on the drosh of Kol, we're going to assume that Heter Mitztaref LeIssur in the case of Aktora Si'ar, because the Torah says Kol Si'ar, and the Gemara adds now Chametz in Tarovis, also Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, because of the same word Kol in Kol Machmetzes Lo Sochelu. And the Ramban points out that the word Kol appears in many, many different Isurim. And he has an entire list of Isurim here. I'll mention a few of them, where the Torah says Kol. For example, in Vayikra Perek Gimel, it says Kol Dam. In Vayikra Perek Yud Aleph, it says Kol Sheretz. And later on in Dvarim, it says Lo Sochel Kol Toev. And basically, the Ramban's shita is that if Rabbi Lazar is consistent and the word kol is always coming to teach me Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, then we have an entire list of Isurim to which we apply the principle of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. Now, not everyone agrees with the Ramban. The Meiri, for example, says no. It's only when the word kol is superfluous. And then Rabbi Lazar derives Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. And there are three cases in which the word kol is superfluous. In all other cases, the Meiri proves you need the word kol because, let's say, for example, in dam, there are different types of dam. There are 5 different types of dam. And we need the word kol to tell me that each one of those 5 categories of dam is included in the Isser of dam. And in sheretz, there are many types of shrotzim, and so forth and so on. So basically, the Meiri's theory is that Rabbi Lazar does not lechatchila darshan Heter Mitztaref LeIssur from the word kol. Lechatchila, if all things are equal, he's going to use kol to teach you every kind of min with regard to that particular Isur. But in 3 cases, he doesn't need that. All chametz is the same, all CR is the same, and all yayin is the same. And therefore, he doesn't need the word kol in any of those cases. Well, in the case of yayin, we have the word mishras, but in the cases of aktora CR and achilas chametz b'tarovis, we have no need for the word kol, and therefore Rabbi Lazar steps up and he says that kol is going to teach me Heter Mitztaref LeIssur.
A clarification.
Yeah.
All these cases here we're talking about where there's no Tam Kikar, right?
Okay, so give me 5 minutes because Tom Kika is going to be a major topic for us today, but I just want to develop it, slowly, step by step. Okay. Now, we're going to ask today 3 questions, but basically we're going to focus our attention on two questions. Question number 1 is going to be the following. what is Heter Mitztaref LeIssur? When does it apply? And this is a fundamental question. Do you have a combination of Heter and Issur, which is called a taroves, or are you eating the Heter separately and the Issur separately? And yet, even though, despite the fact that there's no taroves, we're going to still somehow, and we have to figure out what that agent is, we're going to be Mitztaref the Heter with the Issur, even though they're not physically mixed together. So what would be amongst the cases that we gave? We spoke about Nazir, we spoke about Haktorah CR, we spoke about Chametz. Amongst those three cases, is anyone willing to step up to the plate and isolate one of those three cases in which clearly there's no tarovis? Excellent, Haktorah. Because what are you doing? You're not mixing CR with matzah in some sort of a mixture and then being maktir it. And the Keren Ora is really very confused. How do you have Heter Mitztaref LeIssur in the case of Haktorah? Like he asks the following question, he dramatizes it. He says, here's the Mizbeach. Let's say on one side of the Mizbeach, he's maktir a half a zayis of CR. On the other side of the Mizbeach, he's maktir a half a zayis of matzah. And you're going to tell me that Heter Mitztaref LeIssur? I mean, why? I mean, they're two separate Haktorahs. Ad kedei kach that he comes to the conclusion that the only time we can even imagine the issue of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur is where he does both Haktorahs on the same Mokom HaMizbeach. And then it becomes like one Haktorah vis-a-vis the Mokom HaMizbeach. And again, there's a lot of pilpul over here, whether it's a Mais Haktorah or whether it's a din of the Mizbeach, whatever it might be. But this is that case. But leaving out Haktorah, if we talk about, let's say, Chametz b'Pesach, in the case of Kutach HaBavli, or if we address the case of Mishras HaNovim, where he soaks a loaf of bread or piece of bread in Yayin, in these cases, what happens here? Are we talking about an Achila b'Taroves, where each side, the Issur is Nikar Liatzmo, the Heter is Nikar Liatzmo, but then we mix them together and they're no longer Nikar? I can't even point out where the Heter is and where the Issur is. I just simply know that in this mixture, there's X amount of Heter and Y amount of Issur. And that's going to lead us to Daniel's question about Tam Kikar, but let's, again, I'm trying to go slowly here. This is the part of Nazir that, really takes us all over Shas. We're going to see the Sugis and Chulin and Sugis and Menachos, and again, the Sugis Pesachim that we mentioned. This is like really, an overview of so many different Sugis that overlap. Now, here we have Machlokas Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi, in Masechet Pesachim on Daf Mem Gimel, in the sugya of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur in Chametz b'Taroves, Rashi writes, and if anyone is following me in the Otzer Hayunim, we're on page Samaches, and we're on the left column, the last paragraph, and almost the last few lines on that paragraph that starts with Nemar Batorah. Just curious how many people here might have the Otzer Hayunim in their phone. Yes? Yeah, you want to look it up? Okay, great. So he quotes Rashi in Masechet Pesachim as far as Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. And he says the following. You'll see this about 3 lines up before the end of the paragraph. Shehiktir chatzi zayis sior, v'imo chatzi zayis matzah chayav. Okay, that's one Rashi, and that's the Rashi on Mem Gimel Amid Beis. However, there's another Rashi, which is on Mem Gimel Amid Aleph. And that you'll see in a paragraph at the beginning of this essay on the right column on page Samaches, and it starts with the words Nechleku Rishonim. You have that? Mm-hmm. So he quotes Rashi, who says that what's the case of Mishras HaNovim? Is it that the wine is totally saturated within the entire piece of pas, of lechem? Or is it only that he dipped the pas into the yayin and he eats one part of it, but it's not a total connection, meaning it's not saturated throughout the piece of bread. And he says the following: Nechleku rishonim ketzad lefarish limud zeh. Okay, then. Now, keep in mind this paragraph nechleku, because this is going to touch on the drasha that we mentioned about before, kol. So I need you to keep the place there, but at the same time to fast forward to page Samach Tes, the next page, on the bottom right column, which starts Beis Shitas Harishonim Ha'im Din Heter Mitztaref LeIssur Dafka Bitaroves, and towards the end of that first paragraph, Ikra V'Nechleku Rishonim Im Halacha Zu, this principle of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, He Dafka BeHeter HaMa'urav Im HaIssur, O Sha'af Bi'ofen Sha'Heter Nifrad Me'Issur the Omed Li'atzmo Hu Mitztaref Imo. So again, that's just like a general sketch of the first issue that we're going to analyze today, and that is, when do we apply the principle of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur? So we're talking about a Taroves, where the Issur and the Heter are mixed together. You cannot differentiate and point out where the Issur and where the Heter is. No. Even if the Issur is Omed Li'atzmo, the Heter is Omed Li'atzmo, we can still be Mitztaref. And first he quotes Rashi in the paragraph Kosav, that din Heter Mitztaref LeIssur b'Torah Si'ar, etc. And Rashi says, V'einom me'uravim elakol echad nikar. Rashi goes out of his way in the case of Torah Si'ar to emphasize that each one of the two are separate, are nikar bimkomo. Now, why did Rashi have to go out of his way to point that out? So Tosfos understood from this Rashi that the din of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur is when the Issur is Omed Li'atzmo and Nikar Li'atzmo, the Heter is Omed Li'atzmo and it's Nikar Li'atzmo. Ve'nifradim heim v'kol echad Nikar.
Can I ask two questions on Rashi just to try to understand what he's saying? First of all, according to Rashi, that the Chiddush is when they're separate, that it's Mitztaref LeIssur.
Right.
Then what if they're mixed up? Is that L'divrei Hakol for all these?
Right. So that's on the next page, which is page Ayin, and that's in a paragraph.
There's a complete.
Just 1 second. Where's that paragraph? Just want to show it to you. Oh, the Rash. Take a look on page Ayin. Okay. And you'll see a paragraph that's on the right column that starts Achein, and then the bottom paragraph, Harash. So do me a favor, Yoni, you look that over.
Okay.
I just want to get to it,
Okay.
in a certain sequence.
Second question, just more on the shot level, is Rashi says that the Torah is obviously a little bit different. But Rashi says that he eats them b'vasachas. It's not that he eats he eats the grape and then he eats the bread, but he's eating them together, which
Correct.
means that lamaisa in the mouth they become a taroves.
Okay, maybe.
that-
I don't know.
does
I'm
that
not
make a
sure.
difference?
Because again, what we're trying to do in Rashi is to avoid tarovis. And you'll soon see, again, I'm jumping ahead of myself, but why does Rashi want to avoid tarovis here? Because if it's tarovis, then I don't even need Heter Mitztaref LeIssur according to Rashi. We'll soon see why. Rashi L'shitaso in Hilchas Tarovis doesn't need, he can come to the exact identical conclusion as if it was Heter Mitztaref LeIssur based on the Tarovis. And if I don't need a special drasha, which according to Rabbi Yochanan is limited to Nazir, and according to Zairi applies to Torah and possibly to Chametz and Tarovis, why do I need that for? Rashi's going to argue. Again, that's going to be coming up around the bend, but just accept it right now on faith, if you will, that Rashi has to avoid Tarovis like the plague over here, because if it's Tarovis, then I could draw the same conclusion that it'll get Malchus based on the laws of Tarovis, even without Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. And that's going to apply to every single Issur across the board, with or without the drush of Reb LeIssur of Kol.
Also solves.
So we really want to work without Tarovis.
It also solves.
According to Rashi.
It also solves the Haftarah issue when you don't have a Torah.
And now Tosfos is going to disagree. And, there's another Rashi that we want to see over here. and that you'll see on the bottom, right? The same column. He says, Ochel chatzi zayis chelev. So now we're out of Haktara, so that's good. And we're in classic Macholas Asuris with an Isra Achila. And Rashi says he ate a chatzi zayis chelev, v'chatzi zayis basa. What are the next two words? Anybody have it? It's two lines up before the end of the right column. Bivasachas. That's the key of keys, Rabosai. You should underline that, with red ink. Bivasachas means that he ate them simultaneously. And he did not eat them in a tarovis. So you don't have chelev and zayis in a tarovis, but rather you have a bivasachas situation. And what sets up the bivasachas? The Maisachila. You with me, Rabosai? Again, he ate both a chatzizayis chelev and a chatzizayis bosa b'vasachas. And why does Rashi emphasize b'vasachas? Because Rashi wants to tell you that what's the Mitztaref here? It's not in the chefta, it's not in the zayis of chol, the chatzizayis chelev and the chatzizayis of bosa, but rather in the Maisachila. And this is where Tosfos, you'll see on the top left, has zero tolerance for Rashi. And he says, according to Rashi, he has a whole bunch of kashas. And by the way, this Tosfos appears here in Nazir Daf Lamed Vav and also in Pesachim Daf Mem Gimel Amid Beis. And Tosfos comes to the conclusion that no, the fact that you ate both of them v'vasachas, that's not going to create a tsiruv, but rather we're talking about a case where the Heter and the LeIssur are mu'uravim yachad. And again, this is Tosfos L'shitoso all over the show. Tosfos always repeats this argument, his pet peeve against Rashi, who he understands that Rashi is talking about vasachas, even though zeni karbim zeni karbim. Tosfos always assumes that you can only apply Heter Mitztaref LeIssur in a case where there's a tarovis. But then again, we're going to get into the following problem, which is the next issue, and that is, if it's a tarovis, we have a principle called tam ki'ikar. And if tam ki'ikar applies, then since the Heter receives the tam, then he should be chayiv malchus for eating the Heter. And that, Rabosa, is the overlap here between Heter Mitztaref LeIssur and tam ki'ikar. So let's go slowly. Again, we have to really, really go slowly here. Tosfos understands that the Heter Mitztaref LeIssur is based on tarovis. And now the question arises, why do we need a drasha and a separate halacha deriving it from ki kol that Heter Mitztaref LeIssur? Why not simply assume that since there's a taroves, then that's going to already generate the principle and the halacha of what? Of tam kika. You see where we're entering into a whole new area.
Rabbi, why can't you say this? These are different because the things that the LeIssur here are in of itself is not Isser like chelev. Meaning another in of itself is not Isser. It's only Isser on the Nazir at that moment in time. Same thing with chametz. Chametz is not an Isser food generally, just during those 7 days or 8 days. So tam ki'ikr may not, without the drasha, you may not be able to use tam ki'ikr like you do for chelev.
Right, but we're talking about chatzi zayis of chelev with chatzi zayis of basar heter. I mean, that's the case that Rashi and Tosfos are arguing.
I agree, but what I'm saying is, you could still, the answer to Tosfos could be that tam ki'ikr would not apply to these cases because the Isser is not an Isser in of itself. Meaning it's only
again,
on the Gabra at that moment in time.
No, he's mixing chelev with basar heter, right? There's shuman and chelev mixed together in the tarot.
But I'm talking
so
about,
why not? And Tosfos says on that case, Rashi messed up by saying v'vasachas that because he ate the chatzi zayis chelev with a chatzi zayis of basar heter v'vasachas, therefore Heter Mitztaref LeIssur says no, that's not Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. It's not because of v'vasachas. When, as Rashi says, kol echad nikar b'mkomo, it's only because of taroves. And now the question arises: if you already have a taroves, why not activate the principle of what? Of tam ki'ikar.
That's what I just tried to explain. The tam ki'ikar would not apply in these.
Why? Chelev and basar heter? Why not apply tam ki'ikar?
No, you would apply to chelev and basar. I'm talking about, but then
so let's focus.
That our case.
Okay, but again, let's focus on chatzi zayis chelev, chatzi zayis basar. Rashi applies the principle here of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, correct? Because it says kol chelev. So Tosfos says, what are you talking about? Vasachas? Why not assume that he has a mixture of both together and then he eats it? So now we have the problem of tam ki'ikar. So again, Rabos, if you give me a few minutes, again, we're getting into such profound issues, but let's go slowly. There are two ways of learning tam ki'ikar. And this you'll see on the bottom left on page Samach Tes. And here we get into a sugya in Chulin on Daf Tzadi Tes. And what is the sugya in Chulin about? Well, it's about what's called El Nazir. And the Torah says that this roa of an El Nazir is part of this whole procedure of a Nazir. And Rabbeinu Tam says the following, that according to Rashi Shita, and Rabbeinu Tam is going to subscribe and accept Rashi Shita, one of those rare cases, he says the din of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur is a case where the Isser and the Heter Einom Me'uravim. Says the Karen Ora, Rabbeinu Tam is just reiterating the sheet of his Zayda Rashi and L'Shitaso, and this is all based on Rashi Shita in Tam Ki'ikar. So Rabbosai, these are the lines that I want you to underline here. Again, I don't think you have it in a printed form, but the last two lines on page Samach Tes are the key of keys here. He says that Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam hold the Tam Ki'ikar means Heter Nefach LeIssur. And this is basically a sugya which is called Tipas Cholov. You remember? Where the Mishnah says in Chulin that if a drop of milk falls on a piece of meat, and let's say everything's hot, then if you eat that meat, you are going to be chayav malchus for eating basar b'cholov. Now, how much milk fell in? It says only a tipas cholov. But if that tipas cholov gives tam, that's the Mishnah over there. I think it's on Daf Kuf or Tzadi Tes. If there's a tam, you give it to a kfela to taste, right? And if he tastes a tam of cholov in the basar, then we apply the principle of tam ki'ikar. And therefore he's going to get malchus for eating a kizayis. So what does it mean? It means not that the kizayis of basar is holding on to what? To a tam of cholov, but rather the entire kizayis of meat now turns into basar b'cholov. And that's called what? Anybody remember? Chanan, correct. That's Chanan. Chaticha Nasis Nevela. So if Chaticha Nasis Nevela is generated by Tam Ki'ikar, then it means that the Heter is converted into Isur. And now you again, whether it's a separate halacha bas b'cholov is a whole different discussion. But I'm just saying, just l'saber to Ozen, that you're now going to be chai for eating what was Heter because the Heter is carrying in it what? A Tam of Isur. And that Tam of Isur converts and transforms the Heter to Isur. Well, according to that, does Rashi have the license or the freedom, right, the luxury, shall we say, to interpret Heter Mitztaref LeIssur as a case of Taroves? Well, it can't be, because if it's Tam Ki'ikar, and Rashi Shita is that, like Hanan, the Isur converts the Heter into Isur, then for sure you're going to get Malchus. You're going to get Malchus for eating the Heter, which has in it, carries in it a Tam of what? A Tam of Isur. And therefore, if the Heter on page Ayin is Bolea the Isur, so the Heter is Bolea the Tam of the Isur, Me'ura Vimo, Kfar Yesh Isur. We already have an Isur in the Heter. Why? Because the Heter was Bolea Tam of Isur. And that's called Tam Ki'ikar. And if that be the case, then for sure he's going to be chai for eating a kizayis, even if he only eats kizayis of the Heter. Well, of course, he can't focus on the kizayis of the Heter because it's no nikar. But if he takes a kizayis from this whole mixture, even though there was a less than a kizayis of Isur that fell in, but now the tam of that Isur, like the tipas cholov, spreads throughout the Heter. Now the Heter takes on the what? The personality, the identity of the Isur because of Tam Ki'ikar, and therefore he's going to get Malchus for eating a kizayis of this mixture. I don't need Heter Mitztaref LeIssur in a case of Taroves. Ubehechrech, and therefore, Din Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, according to Rashi, is a chidush that even though they're not muravim, we still apply the principle of Tam Ki'ikar. And now we're ready for Daniel's question. Tosfos, according to Tosfos, who says that Heter Mitztaref LeIssur only applies when there's Taroves, why do I need Heter Mitztaref LeIssur? I'll just apply Tam Ki'ikar. And the answer is that Tosfos holds that what? That Tam Ki'ikar, that the Ikar is converted into Isur, that's only a din d'Rabbanan, That's Chanan D'Rabbanan, or it's a Din D'Oraisa in Basar B'Cholov. But as he says in the next paragraph, that Zui Shitas HaTosfos B'Din Tam Ki'ikar, the Lonis Chadish HaHeter Nesa. He would not be Chayiv. Under what conditions, according to Shitas HaTosfos, would he get Malchus for eating a Tarovis? Let's say we don't apply the principle of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. He would have to have what's called the Kizayis B'Thnei Achilas Pras. That means that he eats the whole Tarovis, and within, if was 9 minutes, okay, I'm just throwing out, there's so many different sheetas about Kidei Achilas Pras, but let's say within 9 minutes of the beginning of his Achila to the end of Achila, he definitely consumed a full Kizayis of Isur. That would be the only case in Tarovis, according to Tosfos, that you get Malchus. But if you can't guarantee that he ate a full kizayis of Isur, then he won't get Malchus, because Tosfos says that Tam Ki'ikar is a brand new halacha that prohibits the Heter, but even though the Heter is also because now it has a Tam inside of it, but it remains a Chefetz of Hetera, and you can't get Malchus for eating that Heter. You can only get Malchus for eating the Isur, like in the case of Tov Kidei Achilas Pras. So basically, Rabbosai, we are now identifying the overlap between two major sugyas in Shas, in Yoredea. One is the sugya of Tam Ki'ikar, and the other is the sugya of what? Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. And it's Haba Atalia. According to everything that we've learned until now, if you hold Tam Ki'ikar means that the Heter is what? Is Nasa Isur, because the Heter is carrying within it the Tam of the Isur. So the Tam of the Isur penetrates through the entire Heter, and it transforms the Heter into Isur. Then I don't have any need for Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. But if, on the other hand, I hold that what? That Tam Ki'ikar does not mean that the Heter is Nefach Lios Isur, but it's only carrying the Tam. And again, we're talking about a tarovis of, let's say, lach b'lach, or maybe lach b'yovesh, and there was bishul, and so forth and so on. I'm not talking about, lach b'lach or yovesh b'yovesh. But if there's an esinas tam, like the case of tipas cholav, then I have to hold that tam ki'ikar means, again, let me go over it one more time. If I hold the tam, it all starts with tam ki'ikar. If Tam Ki'ikar means that the Heter Nefach Lios Isur, then I have a problem. What's my problem? Why do I need Heter Mitztaref LeIssur? For eating the Heter, I'm going to be Chayiv Malchus. I don't need to be Mitztaref the Chatzi Zayis of Heter with the Chatzi Zayis of Isur. But if right? So then I'm really stuck. I don't know what Heter Mitztaref LeIssur is. But Rashi's Shita is that what? And that's Rashi's Shita. That Heter Mitztaref, that Tam Ki'ikar means that Heter Nefach Lios Isur, and if I don't need Heter Mitztaref LeIssur.
When you need it, but it's a much bigger chiddush.
Why?
The chiddush is that even when it's not a tarovis,
Okay. You took the that was the point. What led Rashi to insist, which Tosfos objects to with all tokev, that Heter Mitztaref LeIssur applies when there's no tarovis? The answer is because if there's a tarovis l'shitas Rashi, then there's already an esinas tam. I don't need Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. I'm chayav for eating a kizayis of the Heter. But now that we have our new halacha derived from wherever, that Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, then even though there's no tarovis, and the Isur is nikar liatzmo, and the Heter is nikar liatzmo, but if I eat it together, then guess what? I eat a chatzi zayis of chelim, a chatzi zayis of basar Heter, and I'm going to get malchus. What do you mean? You only ate a chatzi zayis. We don't get malchus for chatzi zayis. And that's the gevaldige chiddush of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, which we're going to try to understand, and that's going to be the second question for us today. But Tosfos l'shitaso, who holds that there's no din of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, even in Tam Ki'ikar, it remains a Heter that's carrying within it what? A Tam of Isur, but it remains a Heter. It's not like through and through, the Tam of Isur penetrates into every fiber of the Heter. It's Heter that's carrying Isur inside of it. And therefore, Tosfos says that there's a gevaldige chiddush of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur where it applies. And that means that we're going to take the Heter and we're going to mitzaref it to the Isur, and it's a case of tarovis. But now the question applies to Rashi. How could Rashi understand Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. The Torah says you don't get Malchus unless you eat how much of Issur? A kazayas of Issur. How much of Issur did he eat? A chatzi zayas of Issur. So how in heaven's tarnation do we understand Heter Mitztaref LeIssur? He only ate half a zayas.
That's the chiddush. That's a chiddush.
All right, it's a chiddush, but the chiddush has to be logical. It has to be understood. You can't just say, well, he's going to get Malchus for eating a chatzi zayis. There's no such thing. There ain't no such thing.
Called Mishra. That's exactly what Mishra
So
says.
I mean, the way I'm understanding is the way Tosfos understands Tam K'Iker is the way Rashi understands Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, which is that according to Rashi, you end up with, you have a kazayis of Issur. Whereas according to Tosfos, Tam K'Iker means that the Ma'isa Achila, you don't require what's the din of kazayis?
Wait, just Yoni, you're saying so many things at once. I just got to slow you down a little. What question are you coming to answer? Just that my head should be focused.
I'm not trying to.
Again, my question is the following, and if you don't mind, I'm going to put this question on. This is Roman numeral 2 of Ashir today. Question on the table is: how do we understand Heter Mitztaref LeIssur according to Rashi? According to Tosfos, it's beautiful. We never said that Heter through Tam converts itself to Issur unless we have the chiddush of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. Fine, but according to Rashi, there's no tarovis over here. So he's eating a half a zayis of Heter. How could he get Malchus for that?
Because the Issur isn't to eat a kazayas of Issur. The Issur is to do a Ma'isa Achila, which has within it an Issur.
So I think
is what Tosfos
I think this is the Pnei Yoshua.
Yeah.
So let's see. I'm going to read to you the Pnei Yoshua, and Yoni, you're going to tell me whether this is what you had in mind.
I'll just say yes.
Yeah.
'Cause,
Right. Yeah, I once gave the Rav a Svara in Shir, and he, of course, the Rav had zero tolerance, so he stops me in the middle. Yeah, Berzon, I hear what you're saying. And then he said it over. It took him 20 minutes in his flowery, And then he turns to me, he says, Berzon, he used to call me Azariah. He never got my name straight. And he said, Azariah, is that what you meant? So what was I going to say? I said to him, yes, but you said it better than me. So this is the Pnei Yoshua. Now, I'm not oriented in the Pnei Yoshua's thinking. That's the truth. Like if you wake me up in the middle of the night and tell me you want to share with me a Pnei Yoshua, I'll say, okay, I was 5 years in the Rav. She never once quoted the Pnei Yoshua, not once. But here I think the Pnei Yoshua is really, really phenomenal. And this is on page Ayin Gimel. So Rabbosa, are you getting the feeling of how much time I put into this year? I mean, do you know how much this may be fast reading for you, but for me, this was not fast reading. But I finally came up with this Pnei Yoshua. That's the first thing that resonated with me. So we're on Daf Ayin Gimel here, and we're in the left column, the second major paragraph. Everybody has it? Okay. He says the following. Let's learn the sugya at the end of Masechet Yuma, which records a machlok between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about chatzi shir, and according to Rabbi Yochanan, chatzi shir also min Torah. So the Pnei Yoshua is going to analyze Heter Mitztaref LeIssur according to Rashi, based on the shita of Rabbi Yochanan that chatzi shir also min Torah. Now, just to jump ahead of myself for a split second, the Gemara gives actually two explanations as to why Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, as to why chatzi shir is also min Torah. According to one explanation, Rabbi Yochanan is based on what's called chazi litztarufe, and the Nod V'Yudah takes this literally, and he says that if you ate a half a zayis before the end of Yom Kippur and then another half a zayis after Yom Kippur ended, then we don't say chatzi shir also min Torah. You didn't even violate an Issa Doraisa because it was impossible to be Mitztaref. It was the last second of Yom Kippur. That's what I meant to say. Whatever I said, I don't remember anymore. But in any event, the Gemara gives another explanation that Rabbi Yochanan derives it from a pasuk, and the Chacham Tzvi, who lived about 5 centuries ago, he has a whole new pshat in what the Gemara means by deriving chatzi shir also min Torah according to Rabbi Yochanan from a pasuk. But says the Pnei Yoshua, let's just lay down the ground rules. Chatzi shir also min Torah. No. So you ate chatzi shir, according to Rabbi Yochanan, you ate a half a zayis of chalev, and you violated the Issa Torah of chatzi shir. So l'chora, you should get what? You should get malchus. Oh, but there's halacha Moshe Sinai that there's no chi of malchus unless he has an achila. V'yein achila pachos mikazayis. V'rak achilas kezayis nechsheves ka'achila. You should underline those words, right? This has the repercussions if we learn Masechet Shvuos. If a person takes a Shvuah shelo ochal this, whether it means a kezayis or a kolshu. But we're saying now that at the Torah's definition of achila equals kezayis. Less than kezayis is not constituting achila. Says the Pnei Yoshua. So we've laid down two rules. Rule number one is that you don't get malchus unless you have a kezayis. And explanation of that rule is because there's no achila less than a kezayis. The Torah doesn't recognize that as an achila. But again, keep in mind that chatzi shir asur min Torah, but there's no malchus unless you do what the Torah defines as a constitution of a ma'asachila, which means kezayis. Lefi zeh efshal lahavin taimo shel din zeh. Now again, the Pnei Yoshua is not denying that it's Xeris HaKosim, that we have to derive it from Yalfutzas, from Psukim. Obviously, this is not something that we would intuitively, logically, a conclusion that we would draw. But we can at least understand what is the motive, what is the mechanism by which the Torah is operating here. How could he be chayev for eating a chatzi zayis, and we're going to give malchus for that? In the previous paragraph, he points out that according to Tosfos, we understand that muravim zebazeh. And then we could say that somehow the Heter picks up something from the LeIssur. Let's call it the Tam of LeIssur. Like Tosfos brings a raya from another sugya, which is called chatos shenoga bechulin. And through that negia, if the chatos is bolea, if the chulin is bolea, something of the basar chatos, let's say the hat and so forth and so on, then a chulin takes on the status of a chatos, and it can only be eaten by zichei kuna and only eaten for a day, and so forth and so on. What? So that's called belia. And if there's belia, then we can understand that the heter is Mitztaref LeIssur because the heter was bolea the Issur. The ilu Rashi, shu Mitztaref af kisha heter va'Issur nifradim. And he used the word af here based on this previous discussion that I showed you from the Rashmi Shantz, who points out that Rashi is telling me that Heter Mitztaref LeIssur applies even in the case of Eino Mu'ravim v'Zeni Kibum Kom, etc. Says the Pnei Yoshua, Lefi zeh efshal lahavin taimo shel din zeh sheheter Mitztaref LeIssur l'sashir, and especially according to Rashi, how do we understand such a thing? He did not eat a kezayis of chaylev. He only ate a kezayis chatzi zayis of chaylev. How can he get malchus? And the answer is kevin she'ochel chatzi shir. He's eating a half a zayis of what? Of chaylev, and that's an Isur gomer min Torah. Narvas, there's no what? There's no malchus. Vasiba shein eloki rak v'chal chisaron be ma'asachila. This is mamish like Reb Chaim. If Reb Chaim would have said this, he would have used the same exact approach as the Pnei Yoshua, who was probably a century before Reb Chaim, or close to it. The efshal lahavin shachilas haheter mo'ila litain lachilaso shem achila.
Exactly.
Right, Yoni? Is that what you were saying?
Exactly.
Okay, fine. Just that you said it better than me, right? Kevach is sof who ochel kezayis sholem. He's eating kezayis sholem. So by eating a kezayis sholem, that ma'aseh achila becomes what? Recognized as an achila. Okay, what was lacking? He had an Issur in the what? In the chefs of the chaylev, because chatzi shir asur min Torah, and basically he should have been chayiv malchus norvas. He's missing a ma'aseh achila. But if he takes that chatzi zayis and he does a ma'aseh achila because he's mitzaref together with that achila what? Chatzi zayis of basar heter, then now he has the shem achila, and so fu ochel kezayis sholem. So we have an achila, and therefore he's chayiv malchus. Wow, this is mamish a breakthrough. Now, what I want to do, how are we doing on the clock? Do we have a few more minutes? I'm always nervous about 13, the time.
13 minutes.
Okay. So basically, what I want to do with you now is the following. This just want to set my agenda here. I want to talk to you about a machlokas between the Chacham Tzvi and the Ksav Sofer in the next paragraph, how to understand Rabbi Yochanan, Chatzi Shir Asur min Torah. Secondly, I want to analyze two sugyas in the paragraph Ochichu. One is from Chulin Kuf Gimel, and the other is from Menachos Daf Nun Dal. and one is based on, I'm not sure who, he doesn't quote by name, I guess it's the Machaber here. The other is Reb Shmuel Rozovsky from the Panovich Yeshiva. Okay, and finally, I found something really interesting in my favorite sefer on your day, which is called Shiurei Arav, that was published by Eliakim Koenigsberg. I'm assuming he's a Gush guy.
No, it's from the
No?
Nazir of Shechter of Gnek, I think.
Oh.
I think. it's-
Oh, in other words, Eliakim used their notes.
I think so.
Okay, fine. So let's see what we can do.
I don't know who it is.
You're thinking of Noah.
Yeah, that's Noah, my friend Noah, my good buddy. Okay, then Rabbosai, here's the machlokes between the Chacham Tzvi and the Ksav Sofer, which again, we could have come up with this machlokas even without the fancy names, and that is, there are two ways of understanding Rabbi Yochanan's Chatzi Shir Osem and Torah. Now, Rabbosai, the goal here is to understand the Pnei Yoshua of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur based on the premise that Chatzi Shir creates a Cheftzah D'Isura Min HaTorah, according to Rabbi Yochanan, and the only problem is that in Malchus we need a Maisachil. That was the Pnei Yoshua, correct? Oh. Now, is it true? I'll just show you the punchline. This is where we want to get to on line 4. Behechrech. Do you see that word behechrech? On line 4 in the paragraph Kiyadua, behechrech shachefza asur gam bekolshu. What that means by kolshu is that left tzedek kazayis is a chefza d'isura. Otherwise, we don't understand the Pnei Yoshua. So the machaber of this Otzer HaYunim, I can't tell you his name, he wants to suggest that whether or not Chatzi Shir Osem in Torah means that the Chefza is Osem in Torah, even though it's a kolshu, it's less than a kezayis, would depend upon two ways of understanding Rabbi Yochanan. Now, I'm going to suggest my understanding, and I'm going to come to the opposite conclusion that he comes to. So you'll be the jury, and you'll decide which one you think is right. And I don't need any approval here because I know I'm right. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just joking. Anyway, so here's what I wanted to suggest. That if Rabbi Yochanan is based on Chazil Mitztaref, then what Rabbi Yochanan is telling me is that every single particle of Isur is a Cheftzah D'Isura. And Chazil Mitztaref proves that. Because if it wasn't that every single particle is an Isur b'fnei atzma, in other words, unto itself would be an Isur, then what happens? All of a sudden, you eat a kezayis, and boom, now you ate a cheftzah d'isura? Do you understand the logical problem that Rabbi Yochanan is facing? How could it be that abracadabra, you ate, 1/5 of a kezayis, not a cheftzah d'isura? It's chatzi shir. You ate another 1/5 of the kezayis, and all of a sudden you get to 5/5, and boom, all of a sudden you ate a cheftzah of chaylev? It must be, if Chazil Mitztaref, which is the whole basis here of Rabbi Yochanan, that each part and parcel is a cheftzah d'isura. But now, wait, just give me one more minute. But now we introduce another approach to Rabbi Yochanan, which is not based on Chazil Mitztaref, but it's Gzeres HaKosuv, Kol Chelev. And according to the Chacham Tzvi, what is this Gzeres HaKosuv, Kol Chelev? He says it's Achshave. Now, what does Achshave mean? Let's say the classic case of Achshave is medicine, right? So what happens? You have, let's say, crushed some substance of Isur, and you mix it together, and you end up with a pill, a medicine. And now you swallow the pill. So the Rosh says in Masechet Chulin that we're talking about Achshave. For you and I, if we don't need this pill, then you crush the Isur, and it loses its shame. But if I decide that I need it, that's called achshave because of my particular situation, then it gains the status of a cheftzah d'isura.
That Rosh is in the Rabbanan, though. No? The Rosh, by...
Is the only D'Rabbanan? I don't know. I don't remember that. I remember Doraisa. But you want to look it up?
But this is the Rosh that talks about eating the what's called the ashes after burning the chametz.
Yeah. All right, I don't know,
The-
Daniel.
the-
But
the
in any
point
event,
you're being-
actually is Doraisa. Maybe it's not the
point
Rosh.
you're
It's
saying, the pill is clearly less than a kezayis.
correct.
And the akshave.
And the
He gets to the
well,
higher status.
again, it doesn't matter what the amount of Isser is, but once you pulverize it, you
Yes.
made it into a powder, then it's not a Heter d'Isura unless there was action. So if the Chacham Tzvi is understanding that Chatzi Shir also in a Torah because of action, meaning I went ahead and I ate a Chatzi Shir, that Chatzi Shir is important for me. I took the time out to eat a half of the zayis of chelev. That was what I had available. That was what I was interested in, and that's akshave. So I would suggest that akshave now upgrades the status of a chatzi shir, and it makes it into a shir shalom because I was machshiv this chefta as a chefta d'isura. It was worth my while. Therefore, I would suggest that no matter what interpretation you take of Rabbi Yochanan's Chatzi Shir Osim in a Torah, it's always based on the fact that at the end of the day, the Chatzi Shir is a Heter d'Isura. Whether it's Chazil, it's Tarufe, or whether it's a separate Xeris HaKosuv, which the Chacham Tzvi identifies as Achshave, we always start with the Heter d'Isura. That's not what he says. So I'll give you, you'll take your time. You want to read what he says in the paragraph that starts with the words Biyadua. But now, with the short amount of time that we have left, we want to study a sugya in chulin, right? There's a very famous sugya. What happens? He eats a chatzi zayis. It's not aesthetically appealing, right? And he regurgitates it. And then he eats the same chatzi zayis a second time, right? So he's chayiv malchus. He's chayiv malchus. For the same chatzi shir, same chatzi nevela. So what does that prove? He says the following. Once again, he doesn't quote any sources. He says, Vochichu. I guess he means the acronym. I don't know. He says the following: Im ochal chatzi zayis isuri kio v'chazar bolo chayav sharei nene grono mikazayis harei she'af shelo nivla begufo yoser michatzi zayis mikol makom u'mechuyev al ma'isa hachila shehi hanos grono b'shir choshev. So as far as the cheft is concerned, what does he have? A chatzi zayis. But as far as the achila is concerned, since Hanas Gronos Mitztaref, the first achila with the second of the same chatzi zayis, that's why he's chayav. So we see that he would have been chayav if not for the fact that there's no mais achila. But if he could take that same hefta and use it for mais achila, then he's going to be chayav. Again, he's assuming
Where?
that's a machlokus Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish.
How do we define
In Chulin, I
what's
forget
achila?
exactly what that, correct? So he's going according to that man the Yomer who says Hanos Grono, and according to that man the Yomer he's chayav. Why is he chayav? He only ate a chatzi zayis. So you see already a breakthrough that you can be chayav for chatzi zayis and get malchus. Why do you get malchus? And the answer is because the only chisaron of the chatzi zayis is not the chatzi zayis, but rather the mais achila. Now he implemented a mais achila of a full kazayis with one half of zayis by regurgitating and eating again. Why? This is mind-boggling.
But it's not really not even it's not even chatzi shir anymore. As far as your gaon is concerned, it had a full
That's not how he's learning it. You're right. You could argue with him, but let's just understand what he's saying. I think it's a brilliant chap. He's saying that I can prove to you that the chisaron in Malchus here is because he didn't have a mais achila, but not because of the chefts of chatzi zayis. And that's basically what Rashi is saying about Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, that even though the cheft is only a chatzi zayis of chelev, since you are mashlim with an achila through Heter of a full zayis, the Torah recognizes that as an achila, and therefore you can get malchus. And where's the precedent in Shas, other than Rashi in Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, that for a chatzi zayis you can get malchus? Here's a case in Chulin where for chatzi zayis you get malchus. Why? Because there was another achila. Again, he's assuming that we're mitzaref the two achilos, and somehow we make it into one achila, and therefore you have an achila. Again, it's a pella. I think Daniel's approach is much smoother, that it's halacha in Hanas Grono. But anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Then according to this, you wouldn't need the special. You wouldn't need to learn out Nazir from anything because you would have it.
Well, no,
you
I
have
think
the Ma'aseh Achila.
let me reformulate your question, Eli, if you don't mind. You'll tell me why is it that in Kol Isurei Torah, according to Rabbi Yochanan, we don't apply Heter Mitztaref LeIssur? If you're telling me that if you ate a chatzi zayis of chelev and you regurgitated, and then you ate it again, so then you're basically saying all you need is a mais achila on a chatzi zayis.
Sure.
Just 1 second. Give me a
That
second.
is my question.
Wait a minute. No, wait a minute. There's something wrong here. Just 1 second. Wait, can I have quiet for just 1 minute? I'm sorry. I need to concentrate for a second. In the case of what? Of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. Heter Mitztaref LeIssur is going to be so we can imply that from somewhere. And then yeah, I would say the following: that Adarabah, this Gemara in Chulin. See, we're going to get into trouble because of Rabbi Akiva. But this Gemara in Chulin is probably based on Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, but it's going beyond Heter Mitztaref LeIssur. What do I mean? In Heter Mitztaref LeIssur, Rashi says there was one Maisa Achila on a Chatzi Zayis of Heter and a Chatzi Zayis of Issur, correct? But now we're talking about two different Maisa Achila, right? Because in the middle, whatever. So he ate it twice. Now, I don't know that Heter Mitztaref LeIssur would apply here in a literal sense, even though conceptually it could apply, but only if you assume that there's one achila, because Heter Mitztaref LeIssur is only within one achila.
According to Pnei Yoshua, that eating that second half a second time turns it into my achila, even though you only eat it half.
No, but again, the Pnei Yoshua is talking about a case of Heter Mitztaref LeIssur.
Right, I'm applying that same idea.
No, conceptually. No, I'm saying the conceptual breakthrough of Pnei Yoshua is certainly here in the Gemara in Chulin, but I think it goes beyond Heter Mitztaref LeIssur because they're two different achilas. And now he quotes Reb Shmuel, and Reb Shmuel has a sugya menachos on Daf Nun Daled Amud Beis. What happens? There's a sugya called Yesh Dichui BiIyun or Ein Dichui BiIyun. We're more familiar with dichui b'mitzvahs, right? Like, for example, the sugya in Sukkah with anovim and I guess that's a hint. You remember the sugya in Sukkah in the third perek, Lulav HaGazel, where he had too many berries and then he took off the berries, so the hadas was already dochui. Now we're talking about dichui b'isurim. What happened in dichui b'isurim? And what happened was he had a full kizayis of chelev and then nitztamek. Now, I'm not sure exactly how that happened, biologically, but somehow it shriveled up. Let's say there was heat or something along that line. And then what does he do? He blows it up. V'tafach. So basically he reestablishes the original size of that chelev. But for one moment in time, it had less than a shear of kizayis. And the Gemara says that if I hold yesh dichui b'isurim, then there's no longer a shear. And once it was mufka from a shear, that particular chelev could never be mechayev malchus, even though now it has a full shear. But there was one moment in time when it was less than a kizayis because it was mitztamek. Yeah? Says Reb Shmuel, listen to this brilliant chiddush of Reb Shmuel, muchach shu shir be'etzem ha'cheftzah shel ha'isur v'lo b'maisa achila. That, in other words, the entire focal point of our discussion as to whether or not you get malchus is whether or not there's a cheftzah d'isura. Why? Because as far as the maisa achila is concerned, nothing changed. The dichui did not change the maisa achila. So at the end of the day, he ate a full kizayis. So yeshkan maisa achila shel kizayis. The Torah would recognize that as a maisa achila. But what's the problem here? The problem is in the chefta. The chefta is not a kizayis. So Reb Shmuel basically is undermining everything that we said until now, and he's telling us that the problem is not the maisa achila. The condition that has to be met in order to achieve malchus is going to be in the chefta. All right, Rabbos, I wanted to share with you something here, but it's not. I don't want to do a botched job. So we really covered a great deal today. I mean, there's just so much here. How many pages do we do? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Basically, I think we summarized the highlights of about 7 pages here of the Otzer Yunim, and I want to wish everyone a great day and thank you for coming and joining us.
Thank you.
And
Good night.